The kulturfilm was a creation of the mid-1920s. Equal part intellectual documentary and didactic pamphlet, it played against the conventional comedies and melodramas that were beginning to abound in the Soviet Union. As a result, they tended to enjoy little success outside of intellectual circles, disregarded by most audiences for their ostensibly antiquated propagandism. Turksib, a kulturfilm about the construction of the Turkestan-Siberia Railway, released in late 1929 during the peak of Soviet experimental silent cinema that saw Vertov, Eisenstein, and Dovchenko release their masterpieces, was an unexpected exception to the norm. A success both in and outside the country, praised by critics, audiences, and intellectuals alike, one of which included the great American modernist poet H.D., who saw in the film for the first time Ford visualized. After slowly falling into obscurity as the canon of film pruned, Turksib now again stands serried to its kulturfilm companions as a virtually forgotten genre in a period remembered only for historical archivization. As cinema, as history passed it by so easily, has its achievement been made so redundant, has thought been visualized as well subsequently. Turksib is a film about the building of a train, the Turkestan-Siberia Railway. Stretching from Tashkent to Almaty, as initially conceived by the first 5-year plan, which would have seen the west of the Soviet Union connect closer to Central Asia, a central economic undertaking to combat the stark grain and cotton shortages that plagued the West in its first years. It is also a film about expansion and progress, civilization and violence. Where we find those exact ideas is in the American Western. Manifest Destiny becomes building socialism. Ingrid's Kleespies, for instance, compared Turksib most directly to John Ford's Iron Horse, a central Western about American frontier mythology, an epic of national expansion, with a train as a direct signifier of the growing republic, made by an equally central director in Ford, the voice of the Western, for whom Iron Horse was his first major work. Of course, the two differ in their respective approaches. While the Western mythologizes a bygone past, the one that certainly overlapped during the early films and novels, Turksib mythologizes an ongoing present. The building of the railroad, binding the fingers to the hand, builds the nation, a process however already completed in the Western, whose images vow to merely vindicate it. Violence too plays a different role in both films. In Turksib, all but centered around man conquering nature through technological advancement and the application of the will, after the prior implementation of socialism had already mythologically dissolved class conflicts. The film, like a thriller, maintains a concrete warlike rhetoric in its conquest of nature. A film that consists of explosions, smoke, coordinated marches, down to intertitles downright speaking of war and nature. The violence in the Western is aimed at the human outsider, most often the inhabitants of the to-be-conquered land. The final battle between civilized Americans and Indian savages as endemic to the Western as a gun is to film noir. In Ford, the conflict expands and metastasizes into the forming communities, which help shape and define it. In these films, there are few moments without disagreement. In that regard, Ford and the American Western is imminent in its concerns, specifying A while traversing B, whereas Turksib is rather practical, focused on calculating the most efficient path from A to B, both factors already properly delineated. Turksib's two central ethnicities, the Russians of the West and the Kazakhs of the East, thus differ clearly from Americans and Indians insofar as there is a lack of violence and vitriol between them, a stance corresponding to the official Soviet rhetoric of benevolent Sovietism and anti-imperialism. Here the East is, in Orientalist tradition, presented as benighted, helpless, but receptive to intervention on behalf of the Russians, who don't conquer but aid, with the train that connects rather than overwhelms. Kazakhs are passive recipients of progress brought by Russia and accepted with little recalcitrance. They join the work effort, albeit only in subordinate rules if their path is opened for them by the Russians who reign both intellectually and physically. Two counter-shahs, camels coming in contact with the railroad, show this quite clearly and help distinguish the train of Turksib to that of the Western. First, a brief momentary uncertainty, perhaps the third of a displacement, a sentiment and an image exalted in the Western, invoking the spirit of the famous Trail of the Iron Horse painting, which stands symbolic for the passing of time, and with it the thematics of the traditional Western. When the Turksib is a doubt, immediately followed by active participation, the camel finds a new role. Unity between the primitive and modern is strive for, vowing to turn the anxiety of extinction into the potential for improvement. Still, despite the clear differences, there's good reason to believe Turksib plays consciously with the Western. Its director, the forgotten Viktor Turin, studied American filmmaking in the US and vowed to combine its genre entertainment with the intellectual edification of the great Russian works of the period. To him, the kulturfilm needn't be dry. As Matthew Payne writes, the production process, Turin approached shooting Turksib in precisely the manner most directors would take in shooting an action film. Turksib films a dormant region and its people, figuratively and literally at sleep, never denying it its obvious beauty, while acknowledging the deficits that a life dependent on nature begets. By contrast, the final shots burst with tempo and intensity as the train blasts forward. But here the train is not so much a new force as a mere signifier for the state of normalcy. The film starts in the factories, starts with the mechanical, the industrial, similar to how one would open a western on a sheriff rather than an outlaw, to establish this order as normalcy. In Turksib then, the train is normalcy. Wide charts contrast against constant movement, which Turin equates with life, suggesting that a life at rest is none at all. If life is movement, then remaining the same does not produce anything, no being without becoming. For this, Turin tracks the movement trajectory from water, the flow of the river, to the camels traversing snow and desert storm, to the eventual train, imperturbable to hardship. Life is movement, as progress.